right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the hidden mechanics of modern oligarchy, the rise of global wealth, and how immense political power is actually shaping our modern world. And to really get a grip on this, we're going to start with a true crime story that kind of changes everything. Picture this. The year is 1973. We're in Miami. So, an executive for a bank in the Bahamas flies in for a date, and he leaves his briefcase in his date's apartment. But what he doesn't know is that the friend who set them up is actually an informant for the IRS. While the executive is out to dinner, the informant sneaks in, pops up on the briefcase, and photographs literally everything inside. The next morning, the IRS looks at those photos, and they find an absolute goldmine. We're talking a massive list of America's ultra-rich using offshore accounts to actively evade their taxes. But get this, here's the wild twist. Instead of a massive crackdown, a newly appointed IRS director steps in and just completely shuts the investigation down. The government intentionally turned a blind eye to the ultra-rich hiding their money, choosing instead to rebrand the unit to focus on, typical crime.
And that single decision had absolutely massive consequences. At the time of that heist back in '73, the top 0.1% of Americans held about 9% of the country's wealth. But today, because they've been allowed to operate by a completely different set of rules, they hold double that amount. Think about that for a second. A group of people small enough to fit inside a single double-decker bus now holds as much wealth as half the entire population.
Now, this really reframes what we think of when we hear the word oligarchy. We usually picture a small group of individuals, right? Like officially running a government. But modern oligarchs don't necessarily need to be in government. Wealth itself is a type of power. Today, being an oligarch simply means having enough concentrated wealth that you can use vast resources to defend that money from the state, and specifically defend it from taxation. And they definitely don't do this alone. They use what experts call the wealth defense industry. And look, it's not some secret cabal of villains in a smoke-filled room. It's an echelon of services only available to the richest of the rich, powered by armies of millions of everyday, well-paid professionals. We're talking lawyers, accountants, lobbyists, and money managers. These are some of the brightest minds coming out of universities, drawn to the private sector, doing everyday paperwork with one singular goal: hiding trillions of dollars so the government just can't tax it.
The core strategy of this wealth defense industry is to purposely muddy the link between who owns an asset and the asset itself. It's like a giant puzzle. So let's say a billionaire has a massive fortune. First, it goes into a fund in the Cayman Islands. Then, a management agreement transfers oversight to a subsidiary in Hong Kong. Then that subsidiary structures investments across Russia, Africa, Ukraine, and Southeast Asia. The connection between the visible asset and the hidden owner becomes this global geopolitical legal maze that underfunded government regulators simply cannot navigate. And this invisible maze works flawlessly. The result is staggering. We're looking at about $500 billion in lost tax revenue globally every single year. In the US alone, the government misses out on roughly $100 billion annually. To put that into perspective, that's enough money to fund several major government agencies multiple times over, just vanishing into the ether of offshore accounts and shell companies. So here is the really crucial question. When the ultra-rich use this sophisticated wealth defense industry to completely dodge their taxes, who actually makes up the difference? Because let's face it, governments still need to build roads, fund schools, and run the country. The financial burden doesn't just disappear.
Well, we do. You and me. Studies from back in 2001 show that the average honest taxpayer pays 15% more in taxes just to cover the gap left behind by the ultra-rich. And since the ultra-rich are paying even less in taxes today than they were 25 years ago, yeah, that 15% penalty you're paying is almost certainly much higher right now. Okay, moving into Section 1, How Wealth Controls Policy, featuring the 2014 Princeton study on democracy. Let's zoom out a bit to see how this immense wealth defense translates into real-world political power that affects every single one of us.
A bombshell 2014 political science study looked at 20 years of data and proved something incredibly unsettling. They found that what average citizens want has essentially a near-zero impact on whether a policy actually passes. But for the economic elites, the ultra-rich, when they want a policy to pass, it is extremely likely to happen. Now, this doesn't mean democracy is totally fake, but it does mean that if average voters want something and the ultra-rich oppose it, the ultra-rich are gonna win almost every single time. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, if the data is this clear, why don't voters just unite and demand change? Well, issues in society can essentially be divided into two dimensions: Horizontal issues are the culture wars, debates over immigration, gender, religion, things that deal with differences among average citizens. Then you have vertical issues, wealth inequality, taxing the ultra-rich. This is the tension between the elite at the very top and everyone else at the bottom. By perfectly tracking impartial data, researchers have shown exactly how the wealth defense industry thrives when we're distracted. The media and political figures constantly feed us horizontal issues, talking points from both the left and the right that have us fiercely fighting amongst ourselves. But as long as we're pointing fingers at our neighbors, we aren't looking up. We aren't noticing the vertical reality that unites us, the fact that we are carrying the economic burden while those at the very top are legally hiding trillions. All right, part 2, the source code. Oligarchy in the Gilded Age and the Constitution. To actually understand why it feels so structurally impossible to fix this today, we have to look backward to the Gilded Age and right down to the actual founding of our country.
Think back over a century ago, during the Gilded Age. Robber barons completely monopolized industries like oil, railroads, and steel. The wealth concentration was staggering, which led to massive labor strikes and a huge populist uprising. The people demanded change. And in 1894, Congress actually passed a federal income tax to curb this extreme inequality. But just 1 year later, 5 unelected judges on the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. It took nearly 20 more years and a grueling constitutional amendment in 1913 to finally secure the income tax. Fighting extreme wealth is notoriously slow because the system is designed with incredible friction.
But here is exactly why that fight was worth it. The historical data clearly shows that when we actually tax extreme wealth, we create a much more balanced, healthy society. That very income tax created the golden age of capitalism in the 1950s through the 1970s, where prosperity was actually widely shared. But, as we just saw with the Supreme Court, our historical system makes achieving that balance incredibly difficult. And that friction wasn't an accident. We're all taught in school that the U.S. Constitution is this masterpiece of checks and balances designed to spread power around, right? Well, scholars point out another reality. Historically, only 1/2 of one branch, the House of Representatives, answered directly to the democratic will of the people. The Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court were all historically chosen by other elites or state legislatures, effectively consolidating power away from the general public. Why build it this way? Because, honestly, some of the founding fathers were explicitly terrified of a tyranny of the majority. James Madison warned that if everyday working people had too much democratic power, they'd use it to demand a more equal distribution of wealth. They designed a system specifically to temper the power of the masses and protect the property of the wealthy elite. So, oligarchy? It's not some new bug in the system. It's a feature that was programmed into the source code from the very beginning. We live in a democracy where your vote genuinely matters, but we also live in an oligarchy where concentrated wealth exercises immense structural power. It's this constant tug of war, a slider moving back and forth between rule by the people and rule by the rich. But listen, we're definitely not helpless here. History shows us that we can absolutely slide that scale back toward democracy. We can demand the enforcement of transparency laws that are already on the books, like the Corporate Transparency Act, to end anonymous shell companies. We can demand that the IRS be properly funded so they actually have the resources to go after billionaire tax evaders instead of auditing your neighborhood dentist. We can advocate for a wealth tax, which honestly isn't radical at all when you consider average citizens already pay a wealth tax every year in the form of property taxes. And above all, we cannot give in to political cynicism. We have to participate to provide those democratic guardrails. Because massive structural change doesn't just happen overnight. It usually follows a societal rupture, a crisis, a depression, some major shift in the world order. In those moments, what previously seemed impossible suddenly becomes possible. So my final question to you is this. Are you paying enough attention right now, cutting through all those horizontal distractions, so that when that moment arrives, you're ready to push for a fairer system?